Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers, and I am with RTI International's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. I will be your technical host and moderator for today. Today's event is entitled "The Time to Collect is Now: DNA Evidence in Groping Sexual Assaults." Our subject matter expert and presenter for today is Dr. Julie Valentine. She is the assistant professor at Brigham Young University College of Nursing, as well as a certified adult adolescent sexual assault nurse with Wasatch Forensic Nurses. Her clinical specialty and research focus areas are sexual violence, intimate partner violence, violence against women, and criminal justice system response to sexual violence. Dr. Valentine focuses on multidisciplinary collaborative research studies uniting disciplines in sexual assault case reform to benefit victims and case processing. Just a quick disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without any further ado, I would like to hand the microphone and the floor over to today's presenter, Dr. Julie Valentine.
Well, welcome to all of you. Good afternoon. So our discussion today is going to focus on touch DNA evidence collecting in groping sexual assault cases. With that, we will also be doing a background of touch DNA and discussing about other aspects of touch DNA regarding other sexual assault cases. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the support for this project and thanks to RTI International and Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, as well as huge thanks to Utah Bureau of Forensic Services. We have joined in multiple collaborative studies, specifically Jay Henry, the director, and Suzanne Miles, forensic scientist, and also research colleagues Dr. Leslie Miles and Dr. Linda Mabey, and several research assistants. I will be referencing a large collaborative study later in the presentation that they have helped with. So let's talk about our objectives for today. First, we're going to give an overall background information on touch DNA in sexual assault cases and factors that influence the deposition of epithelial cells. We're also going to explain evidence collection practice implication from research findings and a specific groper case study. And then finally, we'll conclude with suggestions and opportunities to promote evidence collection in groping sexual assault cases in each of your own jurisdictions. And that really is an overall objective, is to take this information to benefit your jurisdictions. All right, so let's begin. Touch DNA in groping sexual assault. Well, obviously, when we think of that, we initially think of groping sexual assault cases by strangers because we are talking about smaller amounts of DNA, which we know that a victim can have background DNA from somebody that they have been in contact with. But in addition to the strangers, we really need to look at cases in which foreign contributor DNA is not expected as background DNA on body parts or clothing, such as cases in which there's a protective order that a suspect or assailant should not be in contact with the victim. And we're going to expand on this later in the presentation and talk about other applications of touch DNA in sexual assault. So I'd like to quickly do a historical review of touch DNA. In Australia, Dr. Van Oorschot and Jones in 1997 published in Nature an article, DNA Fingerprints from Fingerprints, which really was the first publication that explored developing DNA profiles from epithelial cells, from fingerprints. So that was in 1997. Since that time, there have been a number of research studies and publications about touch DNA, primarily focused on the use of touch DNA in property crimes. And we can look at some of that research as to how it applies in sexual assault or person crimes. But it wasn't until the publication of National Best Practices for Sexual Assault Kits, a multidisciplinary approach, that was published by the National Institute of Justice in 2017, that evidence collection specifically for skin or touch DNA guidelines were presented. So that was 20 years later. Prior to that time in sexual assault, the focus really has been on gathering DNA evidence from bodily fluids, mainly seminal fluids, sperm, and amylase. So let's talk about touch DNA and what we know from research, the variables that impact the amount of touch DNA left on an object. So first we're going to talk about donor shedder status, and you can see listed below gender, age, personal habits, and sweaty or dry hands. Those are some of the things that have been identified as increasing the deposition of touch DNA. And then we're also going to talk about the surface of the object, porous versus non-porous. And then finally we'll talk about the type of contact and all of these, how it relates specifically when we're discussing sexual assault cases. Now I do want to mention touch DNA and the term trace DNA. So touch DNA, that definition is DNA deposited through touch or epithelial contact. Generally, it is in small amounts. Small amounts of DNA we refer to as trace DNA. So those terms are not fully interchangeable. Touch DNA we consider as trace DNA, but they're not interchangeable terms. All right, let's move on to donor shedder status. There's been another number of research articles that have explored this and have categorized individuals as either being a good or heavy shedder, or a poor or bad or light shedder, those that do not leave much of their epithelial cells around on objects. It's been interesting. Some studies have found that individuals are consistently high or low skin shedders, but there have also been other studies that have shown that individuals may not consistently be high or low skin shedders, that there are other factors involved. Multiple studies have shown that gender has fairly consistently shown to influence shedding status, with males observed to be higher shedders than females. Additionally, younger adult males have higher shedding rates. So this finding of this age group of the 18 to 45-year-olds of males really is significant when you think about sexual assault cases, because a number of our assailants fit in that category of males in that age range. Get rid of my little arrow there. So next we're going to talk about personal habits that research have also shown to influence donor shedder status. One is hand washing. There's been fairly strong evidence that recent hand washing will decrease the amount of touch DNA found on an object, yet there have been other studies that haven't fully replicated this finding. So we don't fully know, but we believe that frequent hand washing or recent hand washing will decrease the amount of touch DNA. Additionally, individuals who frequently touch their body or face appear to be heavy shedders. And this is believed to happen because they pick up skin cell fragments from other parts of their body, and they are then deposited on their hands. Now, in discussing sweaty hands versus dry hands, I first want to go over a little bit about the mechanism regarding touch DNA, we aren't fully sure why we have DNA from touch, but it is believed that skin cell fragments are deposited on objects, but that is facilitated by oil or sweat from sebaceous glands or perspiration. So when you look at the two results here, that sweaty hands result in higher rates of shedding and dry hands result in higher rates of shedding, those two things may seem like they're opposite conditions, but sweaty hands, the perspiration increases the amount of touch DNA, as well as dry hands will increase that because it will leave more skin cell fragments. So now I want to move into the surface of an object. Multiple studies have shown that porous substrates like wood or fabric have higher rates of touch DNA or higher yield of touch DNA than non-porous, such as glass. So when you think of groping cases and fabric, we can see that that is very applicable in sexual assault cases and in groping cases. One thing that we have to think about is skin or clothing more likely to yield foreign contributor DNA profile. Bowman and colleagues found that it is actually clothing that is more likely to yield a foreign contributor DNA profile than swabs taken from the skin. We're going to be talking about a case study where this finding will also apply later in the presentation. So we've also found that shedder status, or not shedder status, but the amount of touch DNA left is dependent upon the type of contact. So contact with greater pressure and friction has been shown to increase the DNA yield. Now when you think of sexual assault cases and groping sexual assault cases, they frequently have both, especially if the victim is trying to get away or if there is pulling on clothing or a body part, that there will be both increased pressure and friction, which will likely yield to higher amounts of touch DNA. There have been some studies done on looking at handshake and the transfer of touch DNA when someone shakes hands, and specifically this has been looked at regarding indirect transfer, so shaking hands and then touching an object, and it has been shown that we can transfer, our DNA can be transferred indirectly. And there also have been studies looking at touch DNA in strangulation cases. This seems to be more important when we consider the relationship again between the suspect and the victim, because if the victim and the suspect live in the same environment, how much of the touch DNA on a person's neck is background DNA? So we have to consider, was that deposited from the act of strangulation, or could that be background DNA? So overall, we need more research. We need more research to understand our, improve our understanding of touch DNA and what it means. But we do have enough that we know we should be and collecting and analyzing DNA from groping sexual assaults. And that's what we're going to move into now. So when you consider touch DNA and application to sexual assault, I previously talked about groping sexual assault cases by strangers. We also have to think about groping sexual assault by known individuals, but dependent upon the body location. So if somebody is with a coworker or an acquaintance or on a date, but the touch DNA is found in genitals or on breasts when that was non-consensual, then that can apply to the use of touch DNA. We also have sexual assault by strangers when it could be more than one stranger, multiple perpetrator strangers. I had a case in which a victim was grabbed and put in a car, and one suspect held her down, held her arms, while the other suspect raped her. So there were bodily fluids from suspect number 2, but suspect number 1 just held her down. I collected both evidence for suspect number 1, who held her down from the touch, and suspect number 2, which did include also bodily fluids. We then also need to think about evidence collection of the assailant for touch DNA of the victim. How often are we doing that? Collecting evidence from a possible suspect, from their hands, their fingernails. Feel free to type in any other ideas that you have of application that we can use touch DNA when we consider how to use that in sexual assault. So I'm going to now share some study findings specifically on groping sexual assault cases. These were all cases that there was non-penetration or non-penetrative assaultive acts and no bodily fluids. So we're going to explore victim and assault characteristics and also the sexual assault kit DNA analysis results from these groping cases. So I first need to explain where these groping cases were obtained from. In Utah, I have worked with Utah Bureau of Forensic Services for a large study looking at sexual assault cases throughout the state from 2010 to 2016. We currently have 4,038 cases and are currently with our research team coding 2017 and 2018, so we'll have about 6,000 cases. Represents about 80% of the population in Utah. The information I'm going to share with you, all of these cases were victims who were over the age of 14 years. Our age goes from 14 to 93. They had fully completed sexual assault exams with evidence collected and stated that they wanted to report to law enforcement. So none of these cases were restricted cases. We have a large amount of information, 241 variables per case. For 2017 and 2018, we have added additional variables, so we are about 260 variables per case. So out of these 4,038 cases from 2010 to 2016, we found that we had 66 cases that were groping or fondling sexual assault cases. So we first wanted to look at, were there any differences in the victims between those victims that were in a groping sexual assault compared to penetrative sexual assault. And we found that the majority of victim variables were not significant. Age, gender, race, the patient or suspect's use of drugs or alcohol, if it was a multiple assailant, if it was a suspected drug-facilitated assault. We looked at a number of other variables as well, such as did the victim have any physical health problems? Was the victim developmentally delayed? Did the victim have mental illness? A number of other factors, and found those not to be statistically significant. But we did find these variables to be significantly different. One is the assailant-victim relationship. The other is the location of the assault, a weapon used by assailant, and then if the assailant was injured or possibly injured by the victim's actions. So let's talk about the assailant-victim relationship first. So the groping cases, as you can see, are those that are bolded and italicized. And what we found is that in groping sexual assault cases, there are substantially more stranger assaults, less domestic violence or ex-partner or spouse assaults, and then a higher amount of our category on our sexual assault examination form, which is other. And other captures those who are in a position of authority, such as a boss, a manager, or it could be a coworker, a teacher, a bus driver. So we found in the groping sexual assaults that we had a higher percentage of the assailant-victim relationship in which the assailant was somebody in authority. We then also found a difference in the location of the assault. In the groping sexual assault cases, we had less cases that occurred in house or apartment. So in penetrative sexual assaults, the majority, 63%, occur in a house or apartment, but as you can see, we have much higher rates of groping that occur in a car or outside, or other captures generally public spaces. In penetrative assaults, the most common is hotel, but in groping, it was other public spaces, such as a work setting, an office, or a bar, other public gathering areas. This finding was very interesting. So from 2010 to 2016 on our sexual assault examination forms, the victims were asked, was the suspect injured during the assault? And the victim's options were yes, no, or unknown. And what we found is that in penetrative sexual assault, 53% of the victims did some action, and usually this was an action early in the assault, which the victim was unsure if the suspect was injured or could have been injured, such as scratching or pushing the suspect away. But that was increased in the groping sexual assaults. In groping sexual assaults, 79% of the victims replied that they did some type of action that could have injured the suspect. So it might be that we're finding in these groping sexual assaults cases that would have gone on to be more invasive and violent sexual assaults, but because of the victim's actions, it ended at a groping sexual assault. We also found an interesting finding that we were surprised about, is that in groping sexual assaults, we actually had higher rates of a weapon use, which is interesting when you consider that the victims also seem to have fought back more in those cases with weapons. When we looked into this further, we believe this is explained because we also had higher rates of stranger that was the assailant-victim relationship. So now let's talk about the sexual assault kits that were collected from these 66 cases. So out of those 66 groping sexual assault cases, 31 were submitted by law enforcement back to our state crime lab for DNA analysis, and 35 have not been submitted. So those 35 either have remain in law enforcement custody or have been destroyed. We don't know where those other 35 are, but we can look at the 31 that we know were submitted. So the first step out of those cases was quant male DNA. So when they looked at, you can see the findings here, quant male DNA was found in these groping sexual assault cases 84% of the sexual assault cases, quant male DNA was found, and out of those 13, there was enough quant male DNA found that they could move on to STR DNA testing. And out of those 13, 10 out of the 13 developed a single profile probable assailant. 3 out of 13 developed no comparable data, which meant that there were not enough alleles to form any conclusion or comparison. But interestingly, 0 of the 13 developed a mixture. When we think about where those swabs came from, the majority of those swabs were all skin swabs. We had one case where it had clothing swabs, but the rest of these were skin swabs. So now let's move on and look at YSTR DNA testing out of these cases. So 7 of the sexual assault kits had YSTR DNA testing, and they also had excellent results. 6 of the 7 sexual assault kits with YSTR DNA testing developed a single profile of a probable assailant. Only 1 developed no comparable data, and we actually had 0 that developed a mixture. So what does this mean when we look at what did we learn from the DNA findings? Well, we believe that these DNA analysis findings support the collection of DNA evidence in groping sexual assault kits. Following the collection of the DNA evidence, it supports the submission of this evidence by law enforcement to the crime lab for analysis, and then the final analysis of this DNA. So we propose that groping sexual assault cases, we need to collect the evidence, submit the evidence, and analyze the evidence based upon our research findings. I want to focus specifically on a case study that was one of these cases out of the group that I shared with you. And this is a case which significantly changed our practice regarding groping sexual assault cases. So this was a campus or university groper. Let me give you a little history on this. In 2010, our state crime lab, the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services, validated more sensitive DNA analysis methods, including also testing for YSTR DNA. In 2011, one of the forensic scientists came to our forensic nursing group meeting and shared about the new DNA testing measures, and we discussed that smaller and smaller amounts of DNA are required, needed for testing, and discussed the capabilities of possible touch DNA regarding sexual assault cases, because prior to this, the focus has been on where are there stains, where is there bodily fluid. Now, a side note on this, I want to stress the importance of a strong collaborative relationship between the sexual assault forensic examiners or nurses and the forensic scientist. There should be open dialogue between those two disciplines. We know that approaching sexual assault as multidisciplinary teams benefits our communities, but when we think of the evidence collected, we really need significant communication and sharing of information between the forensic examiners and the forensic scientists. So now let's move on to tell you more about this specific case. So a sexual assault nurse examiner was paid to collect evidence on a groping victim at a university setting, and the law enforcement called and said, we would like you to come to our law enforcement agency. She does not have injuries. She does not want to go to the hospital, and the forensic nursing team practice was to do all exams in an emergency department. They said, but we just want you to come in and swab her mouth because she bit the suspect's finger. So we just want you to come in and swab her mouth. So the SANE explained that she would be there shortly and to not give her anything to eat or drink. When the SANE arrived at the police station, she was met by the police chief and several detectives and police officers, and learned that there had actually been 3 additional victims in the last 8 hours on the campus. And earlier, voyeurism, they also felt incident was tied to this. The suspect, they believed, had been in a female locker room and had taken underwear and put it in his long trench coat pockets, and some of that underwear had fallen out of the pockets when he had run away from one of the groping assaults. With each assault, this suspect had become more and more violent. So the SANE walked down the hall to meet with the patient who was
Just one moment. It does look like we lost audio. Dr. Valentine, are you still there with us? Okay, just give us one moment while we get Dr. Valentine back on the line. Okay, she's going to be calling back in momentarily. While we are waiting for her to call back in, just some quick notes. We will have a PDF version of today's slide deck available for download during our closing, as well as a few other reference materials that Dr. Valentine has provided for us. So once the Q&A session is finished, we'll move into our closing and you'll be able to download those at that point. Dr. Valentine, do we have you back on the line? Okay, we can hear your audio.
Hi,
Let's go ahead and bump your audio levels back up since you did have to hang up. If you could press *5 on your phone again 3 times. Yep, that's perfect. All right, you can continue on right where you left off.
Okay, sorry about that audio. Hopefully we're all back together again. So I believe that, let me go back and just cover this Groper case study. So the SANE had gotten background that there had actually been 3 other victims, and also groping, and that there had been a voyeurism incident, and the assaults had become more and more violent throughout the day. So when the SANE was taken down the hall to meet with the victim and her mom in a room, she found that when the door was open, that the victim was finishing a Subway sandwich in a big gulp. And I just want to remind you, she had been called in to swab her mouth as the victim bit the suspect's finger. So the SANE explained that it was likely she would not obtain any evidence from the victim's mouth, but thinking back on this meeting with the forensic scientists and the forensic nursing team, thought, but perhaps we have a chance because we have a serial perpetrator had attacked 4 women in a short time period one day. Perhaps the option is then to try to obtain touch DNA in the case. So the nurse went in to assess the patient and provide care and resources with a victim advocate and got the assault history. So what happened in this case is The victim was in a parking lot walking to her car. It was night, and saw the suspect walking towards her. As she clicked open her car and tried to get into the driver's side seat, the suspect grabbed her by the shoulders, shook her shoulders, ended up pushing her down across the driver's seat and the front seat. She was screaming. She lost both of her contacts during this assault, so had trouble seeing. He took his hand. One hand was trying to muffle her screams. The other went up her skirt, on her abdomen, under her tights, and went on top of the front part of her underwear. And as she was pushing back and screaming, somehow her key fob that had an alarm on it had fallen to the ground, but the alarm sounded. And when that happened, her car alarm went off. It must have gotten bumped in some way. The suspect ran away. The victim locked her car and started her car, but she didn't have her contacts, was able to call 911, and law enforcement was able to find her. So with this, the nurse moistened 2 cotton-tip swabs for each area with sterile water and collected swabs. Did do the oral swabs. Also lips around mouth and chin where the suspect's hand had been to try to muffle her screams. Collected from her lower abdomen. The victim had reported that he had kept trying to fumble with her jacket button to get her jacket off. It was just one button, but the jacket button was smooth metal, but did collect from there. And then the victim was able to point and say it was this front lace part of her underwear. The SANE collected swabs from there. The SANE also collected clothing, jacket, tights, underwear, and skirt. And you can see our current recommendations are for SANEs or law enforcement not to collect swabs from clothing, but actually to collect the actual clothing unless we have a case where a victim will not share that clothing. So law enforcement identified 5 suspects. The description of the assailant was very large, about 6.5 feet, 6'5", and about 250 pounds. One suspect was determined because of the body size, but also he had been arrested the year before for voyeurism in a female's bathroom on campus. They found him at his place of employment and found that he had a bandage on his finger from the bite mark. They were able to obtain a buccal swab from the suspect. And here are the DNA findings from this groping case. So you'll see the top part are those swabs that were collected by the forensic scientists in the crime lab, and this initially is the YSTR. So you can see in reading the brief history of the assault, the forensic scientists collected evidence from the jacket shoulders because the SANE had written how he had grabbed the victim and shaken her by her shoulders and pushed her down, and that the suspect did match the major portion. The tights, also, he matched the major portion. The underwear, they did not find male DNA. In looking back at this case, we learned the SANE did not designate that it was the front panel, the lacy front panel portion of this underwear, where the victim said she had been touched and where the SANE collected swabs from. But traditionally, in sexual assault cases, the crotch of the underwear is tested, and that's what was tested on the forensic science part, which showed male-male DNA. The swabs collected by the SANE The suspect matched the major portion of YSTR, the lower abdomen, skin swabs, the underwear. No male DNA was found on the jacket button. I want you to think back what we talked about, the porous and non-porous. The porous, such as fabric, were more apt to find touch DNA. The jacket button not only was a smooth metal button, but the victim had put on hand lotion and then had been fiddling with her button during the interview, and that may have removed that DNA. And then also the skin swab from around her mouth and chin, the suspect matched the major portion. Then when we go on and look at the STR testing, as you can see, the top portion is the forensic scientist, and the suspect was not a part of the mixture from the jacket, shoulders, or the tights, but the swab that was collected by the SANE of the underwear. Now that lacy portion was rougher, was not a smooth material. Very likely that is what helped to trap that touch DNA and developed a full STR DNA profile that was CODIS eligible and matched the suspect. So the outcome from this case is the victim, because of the trauma that from the assault, was unable to identify the suspect in a photo lineup. But the DNA findings, the prosecutor wrote, the DNA findings made all the difference. And because of the DNA findings, a plea bargain was reached. The suspect actually is now out, but is on the sex offender registry. And when we think about this case, we also need to consider that each one of these assaults that happened that day had increasing violence. We don't know what would have happened with this assailant if it would have continued to escalate. But by using DNA technology to identify groping sexual assault victims, we can hopefully avert future assaults and then also provide evidence-based therapy for the offender, hopefully earlier on during the offenses than if it continues, and have better outcome for all. The victim outcome, I have spoken with the victim and told her how this case really helped improve our practice in collecting evidence in groping sexual assault cases. She ended up needing to take a semester off of school and had therapy, but told me that knowing that her case has helped improve our practice has helped her more with her healing than anything else. So changes in practice from this case. Working together between the forensic examiners, forensic nurses, and the forensic scientists, we developed a touch DNA form for collecting evidence in groping or stranger assaults. We changed our examination form to provide a notation of the contact, and we also have done a number of educational programs for both SANEs and law enforcement on the importance of collecting DNA evidence in groping and stranger sexual assaults. So here's a picture of our stranger touch DNA documentation. It is available for download as well as a PDF, as is this PowerPoint as a PDF, that goes through a very simple documentation on groping sexual assaults. So as you can see, it is set up to list the item of clothing, to then also draw it on the body diagram, and then to write in the location and the type of touch. We discussed earlier that the type of touch is important, because if we have higher pressure or friction, we know that we see higher yield of touch DNA. So the saying in the case study did not do this, and this we found this is definitely needed for that improved communication between the forensic examiner and the forensic scientist. We then have it written below. We ask the patient to remove the clothing and then fold the areas of touch inward and place in an evidence bag, label, and seal. Rather than collecting swabs from clothing, our strong recommendation, based upon other research studies also that have shown a higher yield from clothing, is to collect the clothing and send that to the crime lab for analysis. Now, this form was made for forensic examiners, but also for law enforcement to use. If there are not swabs that are needed from genital areas or intimate areas, law enforcement can collect the clothing items and send that in without contacting a forensic examiner. So let's talk about the kind of nuts and bolts of collecting the evidence if there is a groping sexual assault and a forensic examiner is collecting touch DNA from skin as well as collecting clothing to send in. So our most current recommendations come from the National Best Practices for Sexual Assault Kits. And recommendation 8 says examiners should concentrate the collection of evidentiary samples by using no more than 2 swabs per collection areas to not dilute the biological sample. So the focus definitely is to concentrate DNA. This would be 2 moistened swabs held together and collected at the same time. You can see this recommendation is listed below. Based upon current evidence retention policies laws, it is recommended that when more than 1 swab is collected, these swabs be collected consistently, such as moistened swabs. On page 21 of the National Best Practices, it lists the following for skin for touch DNA. Use 2 lightly moistened swabs across the affected areas, and then package per policy. Now, when we are considering touch DNA, again, we are thinking that we are having smaller amounts of DNA, so those trace DNA. So it is incredibly important that we take all precautions to avoid cross-contamination and contamination. So this means single-use tools and lubricants, obviously, to limit the number of people in the room, support person at a distance from the swabs. At the time that we collect our swabs, if we have males in the room, whether that be a support person, we ask them to wear a mask during the actual time that the swabs are moistened and out and drying. The examiner should wear both gloves and a mask during evidence collection and should also avoid talking during evidence collection to avoid having any kind of cross-contamination on those swabs. And the other change that we've made that I touched upon was we've made changes on our sexual assault examination form. So on our skin swabs, again, this is to improve our communication between the forensic examiners and the forensic scientists, is the forensic examiner notes if the contact was amylase, seminal fluid, or epithelial cell. So let's talk a bit about what does the future hold. So with touch DNA, we really have advancements in DNA testing that are ahead of where we have been in as far as our practice and policy. And it's very likely that that is going to continue. We're going to continue to see more research on methods to improve the collection and extraction of trace DNA. Some of the research articles out there regard rather than using sterile water on cotton tip swabs. There are different forms of detergents to use that have shown to have higher yield than later for touch DNA or trace DNA. There are different types of swab material that have very promising results, different types of swab shapes, taping and mini tapes as well, MBAC. Those are all different products. And then we also have changes in processes, direct-to-PCR amplification, rapid DNA. If you have other methods, feel free to type those in as well to share. But the line at the bottom, per jurisdictional policy, this is incredibly important. It's really looking at this as a multidisciplinary team within your jurisdiction and say, how are we going to incorporate these new findings, these new applications of DNA into helping better serve our community. So then multidisciplinary education. So who do we need to educate regarding the application of touch DNA? Obviously, forensic examiners, healthcare providers, and forensic scientists. The law enforcement is huge because oftentimes it is law enforcement that first are notified about these groping sexual assault cases, and if they do not refer the victim to have evidence collection, then we will never get this information. We have found that this is especially important with campus and transportation law enforcement. In our discussions and meetings, many times they see more of the groping sexual assault cases. Also very important to include the patrol officers because they might be the ones that are being notified of these groping sexual assault cases. And then, of course, the whole multidisciplinary team, prosecutors to understand the application of touch DNA and groping sexual assault, victim advocates, and then our sexual assault response teams. So how do we go about doing the multidisciplinary education? A logical place to start is the multidisciplinary START meetings to discuss educational strategies, share this webinar and paperwork, and then create a training program for your jurisdictions. And then when this is the DNA analysis methods have improved. We now need to change our practice and policy to meet those and to utilize this excellent aspect of DNA analysis in these groping sexual assaults. And I talked about earlier specifically on this case, we do this to improve the safety of our communities, but it's also to hopefully prevent escalation of crimes, to identify perpetrators earlier so that we can intercede and hopefully make a difference regarding their therapy as well. So the final webinar takeaways before we go into questions is I hope you've gotten an underlying theme from this, the importance of a strong multidisciplinary collaboration in incorporating the advancements in DNA. Specifically today we talked about touch DNA into addressing sexual assault violence in your community, the importance of educating throughout the disciplines on touch DNA, and that evidence in groping sexual assault cases should be collected, touch DNA evidence, also not just in sexual assault cases, but we can apply the same things with touch DNA in other sexual assault cases, and we should be collecting that evidence
the first
and
one
submitting
is
it
asking,
and analyzing
do the
it.
research offer any
And with that, we
suggestion
will
as
move
to
to
why
questions.
men shed more than women?
The research really does not say exactly why we think that is. Are they sweatier? You know, we know that sweat plays a portion in increasing the touch DNA yield. But we have had there's some conflicting research out that there are some studies that have not shown a difference between male and females. Most studies have shown a difference, and it has
next question is from Amy
overall
asking, should we be
swabbing
the clothing before
45
submitting it to a
seem to
crime
be
lab for
heavier
evaluation?
shedders than other genders and age groups. I wish I could tell you we knew why, but at this point we don't. So we strongly believe you should be submitting the clothing to the crime lab, but with that submission, you also need to clearly state where it was touched in the clothing and how it was touched, because we know that will help guide where they will collect that evidence. Now, in cases where you could have a groping case where someone does not want to give up their clothing, in that case,
next question. You might have touched on this
yes,
a little bit in your presentation as well. Have any methods been used
to
to test
that
whether
by
enough touch DNA
swabs,
can be collected
holding
from
them
the skin,
together,
like for an
and then
example
documenting
during a
exactly
strangulation
where they were
case?
collected from the clothing item.
Have any other methods been used to test whether enough touch DNA can be collected from the skin, like for an example during a strangulation case?
Say that again. I'm not totally clear on the question. So the studies that I am aware of regarding touch DNA in strangulation cases have been focused on the swab technique, the moistened swab technique. There have been some conflicting findings regarding if it is a domestic violence situation, how much of that could possibly be background DNA.
Okay. Next question is from Taylor asking, does the shedding status
really need to
of
be
the
interpreted
victim
somewhat
affect the
with
ability
caution,
to get
and that
a
would be
suspect
through the
profile?
forensic scientist's interpretation in your jurisdiction. Great question. And I would say I don't know, and I don't think research can answer that right now. And it would also depend on where. So there have been studies that have looked at different parts of the hand. Do we see increased shedding? We actually have found more shedding happens with fingertips than the palm of the hand. So does that impact if the victim is a higher shedder? Are they then going to be reducing that amount
next question is asking, how long can undisturbed touch
I am
DNA
not sure, and I don't know,
on a person
and
or
I've looked at
object?
lots of research articles on this topic, and I don't know of any research articles that have explored that exactly. Great question. Again, this is an area of growing research, so we are not completely sure. In the National Best Practices document, there is a chart which gives guidelines on hours of collection from the time of an assault to the time of evidence collection. Touch DNA is not in that table because at the time this was written, and I would say now, we do not know. I think the best is, when in doubt, collect. I have a case in my study, now this isn't touch, but this is an amylase and touch both, where a victim had her exam 3 days after the assault. She had showered once or twice. We're not totally clear if it's once or twice. We got a full STR DNA profile from her neck swab. The suspect had had his hand on her neck and had also kissed her neck.
Okay, next
but
question
she
is
had
from Karen
showered.
asking, is
The
it
nurse went ahead
possible to
and
get
collected,
DNA from another body
and
part
that's where the
besides just
DNA
the
profile
hands
came from.
the
So
friction
I think
between
when
the
in
two
doubt,
bodies?
collect, but we don't totally know our time frame on that. Yes. So we think about with sexual assault, if there is a penetrative act, so if there's penis and vagina, but there is no ejaculation, we very likely could be getting DNA from skin cells from the penis rather from any kind of bodily fluid. Or with children, many times we don't see penetration, but we can see body parts such as a penis like rubbed between buttocks or on a child's genitalia.
This next question might need some clarification, but Samuel's asking, what amplification
so
kits are these
not just
findings
hands.
based
We're
upon?
talking about any surface of the body rubbing against another person's body or clothing. I am not a forensic scientist, so I'm not sure 100% how to answer that. I know some of our cases have been outsourced to an outside lab. In fact, many of our cases, and some of those were the Groping cases. Currently, our crime lab
next
question is,
I'm trying to remember
what they're using currently, but I don't know the exact answer on that. You feel free to email me directly, and I can put you in contact with the forensic scientists that I work with at our state crime lab. Yes, I do. And in the national best practices for sexual assault kits, it is stated. So the same guidelines for touch DNA that we see for adults, we would also apply that to children. Now, again, I will reference that, we have a couple research articles that show we might be getting higher yield from
next
clothing.
From Mark is
we
asking,
see that this with other aspects
what was the length of
clothing
time
or
from
bedding.
the offense to the collection
I would
of
say
the
you would
sample
want
examined
to collect
for
the skin
success
as
of
well
STR
as
profile
any
development?
clothing. So that was fairly short. It was 3 hours.
Next question is asking, how were your samples
between
extracted?
3 and 4 hours from the time of when the assault happened on that Groper case study that I shared and when the examination was completed and the evidence collected.
Okay, so we've had a few questions come from a few different audience members. It was actually something that you and I were speaking of before the webinar started.
Again, I'm going to have to refer
issues
you to
with
the
secondary
forensic
transfer,
and feel free to
such as
email me, and I can get you in
cross-contamination.
touch with them.
If one person shakes hands with person A and then touches person B, will A's DNA end up on person B?
Right, right. So there are a number of articles that discuss or are looking at this aspect of indirect transfer. And for good reasons. We need to be able to explore, could we place somebody at a scene of the crime, but it's through indirect transfer and they are not actually there. Right now, we don't fully understand all the mechanisms of indirect transfer. It absolutely still relates to the shedding status of individuals as well as the substrate material and the type of contact. More research is going to be coming out on that. I think the best is if you have a situation where that is of concern, the forensic scientists then will be interpreting what that looks like, which oftentimes will be a mixture, and they are the ones that are best suited to really state what does this mean. As far as research side, this is still an area that needs a lot more research. So we are not fully aware of all of the application of indirect transfer. Yes, so the MVAC, you can actually Google it. It's a company that it's kind of like a suction device, like a vacuum, that vacuums up or suctions up material, DNA fragments, and puts it in a different type of canister. Now, I'm not familiar with it. More than that very basic description, I have not used it before. There has been a lab in California that has done more research with that. So I would refer you to talk to your
asking if you could repeat
crime
where
lab.
to find the touch
if they
DNA
have any
form. Is that one of
knowledge
the
or
forms
have
that we
worked
have
with that,
in the
you can
closing?
also look up the company directly just by Googling.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, we will have that form available for download as well as the PDF of today's slides in the closing directly after this Q&A. Next question is, have the two moistened swabs been compared to the wet and dry swab method? And if so, has it shown to be better?
Yeah, so that's an issue on multiple levels, not when we're just talking about touch DNA. I know when I worked with the Sexual Assault Forensic Evidence Reporting Act working group in developing national best practices, it was really felt by the forensic scientists as part of that team, many of whom came from FBI and SWGDAM, that the best results were to concentrate the DNA. And so if you look through those recommendations, for instance, rather than cervical and vaginal swabs, it's just two together as vaginal vaults. But that same idea of concentrating means rather than doing a wet and then a dry swab, you do two together as wet swabs, let them dry before packaging. They do recommend if you and of course, all of this is based upon your multidisciplinary team and your jurisdiction, so I would discuss this with them. But if someone is using the wet and then a dry
next
swab,
question is asking, is there a difference
to make sure
with
to label
the type
which
of
ones
cell
were wet
received?
as the first swab, and then label the dry swab as the second swab, so they're aware of when each are collected.
The type of cell, I'm guessing skin cells or other types of DNA.
The type of what did you say? Oh, okay. Yeah, so regarding the cells, um, so you know, a living cell, we're going to see more DNA rather than fragments of these cells that we think that we're seeing with the skin cells. So that can make a difference. But with the touch DNA, we are focused more on the epithelial
Next question is if you would
skin cell
explain
fragments,
what is taping and
which
mini
are
tapes.
enhanced, as I talked about, with oil and perspiration, and also if there's dry, flaky skin.
Okay. Next question is if you would explain
So those are products, and you know, I don't want to endorse any specific product, but there are products on the market that there have been some research articles that have shown that they have had higher yield of DNA profile than our traditional swabbing techniques. Some of those are tapes and mini tapes. There are different companies that make these different types of tapes. And I would say that would
Next, we have a
be
question
something
from
to
Elliot
discuss
asking, have
with
there been any
your
studies you know
forensic
of on the
scientist at
use of
your crime
vacuum
lab.
metal deposition
Those are
to locate
generally
possible
used
sources of touch
within the
DNA
crime
on
lab
clothing?
on clothing or objects.
Okay, not a problem. Next question is asking, for the other groping cases that you did look at, besides just the case study, how often were you
I do
successful
not
in
know
generating a full foreign
of
profile?
any research articles specifically on that. So very successful. Let me turn back to those, and I think those findings really support the collection and analysis. So out of the 13, so there were 84% of the sexual assault kits had quant male DNA found. So that was 26. So, you know, we're talking about a smaller sample size, but I think it's still significant. Out of those, 13 went on for STR DNA testing, and 77% developed a single profile, probative profile of the assailant. Then out of those that had YSTR, it was 86% developed a single profile probable assailant. So I think those really support that we do collect and analyze
before we do move into our next question, we do
DNA in
have
these
a few
groping
minutes
sexual
left.
assaults.
Dr.
And these,
Valentine, do you have your
again,
contact
the one
information
I shared with you had
perhaps on your
clothing, but
slides,
the
or
others,
is,
these
yep,
were
there
from
it is,
skin
perfect.
swabs.
Perfect. All right, so if, for our audience, if you want to go ahead and take that information down, it will also be in the slide deck that you can download, just in case you do have any follow-up questions. Our next question is from Kimberly asking, would you please reiterate why the
Yep, there
terms
it is.
touch DNA and trace DNA are not interchangeable?
So touch DNA is referring to DNA from epithelial cells. Trace DNA is referring to small amounts of DNA. So touch DNA really is saying where it came from. Trace DNA is
Okay,
saying
the next
the
question is
amount of
asking, do you
DNA.
have any
Now
specific
generally,
packaging
touch DNA
recommendations
is
for
also going to
touch
be
DNA
trace DNA
swabs?
because it's a small amount, but they do not mean exactly the same thing. I would follow your jurisdictional policy for touch DNA swabs, the same as you do for any other swabs that you would collect in a sexual assault examination. And again, I would refer, I hope all of you have downloaded the National Best Practices for Sexual Assault Kits, a multidisciplinary approach. If you haven't, you can just Google that, and that is a free document that hopefully all on your SART team have, that really provides the most updated guidelines looking at it multidisciplinary. But in there, it talks about, and then we also have the national protocol, is just packaging them separately, two together. And I talked beforehand, if you are doing wet to dry in your jurisdiction, please label which one's first and which one is collected second, and just have packaged those
last
when
question that we
they
have
are
for the day.
fully dried. And again,
this
I
might be a
can't
little
stress
out of
enough
your
the
scope.
importance of avoiding
On our skin there
contamination
does
by
exist
wearing gloves
microbial
and
fauna.
masks and not
To what extent, if
talking,
any,
having
does
anyone
this
talk
affect the
near those
analysis?
open swabs. Yeah, I saw that question, and I actually have not seen any research
Dr. Valentine, I know you did
specifically
have
that
quite a few
has
reference materials that you have
addressed that.
put
So
at the end of your
I'm not
slides.
sure how
So
to
if you
answer
want to go
that,
through
but I
those real
haven't
quick,
seen
just to
any
give our
research
audience
on
members a
that
little more
specific
insight
question.
as to why you added those, and then you can leave us with any last words before we move into our closing.
Sure. Sure, and these are listed on the PowerPoint, but I also made a separate document that is a PDF document that just lists the references as well. And you can see a number of these are very recent. In 2018 and 2019, a lot more articles have come out about touch DNA. So this first article by Bowman I referenced, this is the article that found more DNA yield actually from clothing than from the skin swabs. The next talks about the substrate of the material. The next goes into the type of touch, and then we have several articles about shedder status. The article that is coming up that I specifically want to mention is this article. Let me move it right here. This recent one in 2019, which is DNA Transfer in Forensic Science, a review. This is an excellent article. It just came out in January. Goes not only into touch DNA, but other forms of DNA transfer. I highly recommend this by Dr. Vandershot. Excellent article. Also here is the first article that I talked about that really was the first published article.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Valentine. We are going to go ahead at this time move into our closing.
20 years later, we now
switch everyone's
really
layout now
in
to
practice
our closing
that we
slides.
Need to be collecting
the first thing we'd obviously like to do is thank Dr. Julie Valentine for not only her presentation today, but also all the countless hours of research that she has put into her project. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. We also obviously would like to thank the audience members for joining us today. We had over 350 people attend today's webinar, so we definitely appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day and supporting not only our Forensic Technology Center of Research, but also all of the effort that Dr. Valentine has put in. So thank you everyone for joining us today. You will find in the center of your screen there our link to our customer satisfaction survey. If you simply click the word here, that will open up a new window for you, and you'll be able to run through our quick survey just to give us some valuable feedback, not only about the delivery of our webinars, but as well as the content that we are offering out to you, our forensic community. Julian also there in the chat pod has made mention of our file share pod. I'll move that around just so everyone can see where that is located. In this file share pod, you will see the slide deck from today's webinar that you can download, as well as the resources PDF, and then the last form that Dr. Valentine has provided for all of our audience members. So make sure you do download those before you leave today. Simply click on the title of the file and then click the download files button directly below that. You will also see there in the chat pod, Julian is posting all of our social media outlooks, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Be sure you are following us on there, as well as our podcast. We did just start a new podcast. I think we are on our 3rd episode for this season. So if you have not subscribed to our podcast, definitely check that out and subscribe and listen to all of our new podcasts that we're putting out, as well as the last 5 seasons that we have put out. You will also find our website there that has links to all of our no-cost forensic offerings, from webinars, reports, podcasts, and success stories. So make sure that you check out everything that Forensic COE is offering. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Valentine, for your presentation. Thank you to all of our audience for joining us today, and we hope everyone has a great rest